we'll turn our attention very quickly to our next panel, which is a fireside chat, how public and private partnerships can help us become more sustainable. And we have Dr. Este Geraghty from ESRI, Barbara Ryan from the WGIC, Nadine Alameh from OGC, and Stephen Ramage from GEO. And this is going to be moderated by Este Geraghty. So thank you so much. And Este, I will turn the panel over to you.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that. And good day, everyone. Honestly, I feel really privileged to moderate this conversational discussion that we're about to have today that is really meant to explore our experts' view on how geospatial data and technologies can advance, support, and sustain global conservation efforts with a special focus on the role of public and private partnerships in that entire endeavor, because honestly, those partnerships are necessary elements to delivering an Earth archive. And, you know, I think it's somewhat grounding and perhaps for me anyway, it's overwhelming to consider that this planet, Earth, has really been our home and many will say our playground for well over 200,000 years. And so much has changed. In some ways, technologies and practices have evolved and they've advanced. Yet in other ways, and I'm sure many would agree that those advances have taken us down paths that have unfortunately devolved and deteriorated our natural resources in frightening ways. And I, for one, know we can do better. And that's why I am very excited to moderate this conversation that positions conservation and sustainability in the forefront of geospatial technological progress and endeavors to consider how we can work together, leveraging those public-private partnerships to get really tactical on the issues of the day. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome our amazing discussants, Nadine Alameh, Chief Executive Officer of the Open Geospatial Consortium, Stephen Ramage, Head of External Relations for the Group on Earth Observations, and Barbara Ryan, Executive Director of the World Geospatial Industry Council. Welcome, guys and gals. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here to share your knowledge and your perspectives today. So I do want to dive right in, but before I ask my first question, I do want to encourage the audience to submit your questions in the Q&A section of your Zoom panel. I'm going to be monitoring those and I'll pose as many of them as I can to Nadine, Stephen, and Barbara. Okay, so I know that each of your organizations has really an amazing global reach and supports geospatial science in different and actually very complementary ways. So I want to give each of you an opportunity to take a few minutes to introduce your organizations, yourselves, your role, and I'd like to start with you, Barbara.
All right, well, thanks an awful lot. Stephen, you got a haircut.
Especially for you.
Okay. Well, listen, it's a pleasure to be here today, and it's an honor to be representing WGIC, the World Geospatial Industry Council, relatively new industry council, a not-for-profit trade association of just private sector companies that work in the geospatial ecosystem. So anywhere from Earth observations through hardware, software, all the way out to value-added providers, service providers, and developers of tools. And so I'm really excited about this because I think it's really important that the public and private sectors come together. And for those of you that know me, know that I've worked my entire career on the public sector side. So this is a change for me coming over to the not-for-profit association with private sector companies, but delighted to be here. Thanks, Este.
Very glad to have you. So Nadine, tell us a little bit about your organization.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I'm very excited about this fireside chat. So I'm Nadine Alameh. I'm the CEO of the Open Geospatial Consortium. And we are a global consortium, or I prefer to call it a global community of 500 plus organizations, private, public, and academia. So private, the ESRI, so Este, ESRI, the Hexagon, Oracle, Trimble of the world, to the AWS, Google, Apple, Microsoft, to the countless startups that nobody has heard of, but they are using data and analytics to change the world. The public, our public partner, including the major government organizations like, the NASA, the NOAAs, the MGAs, and their equivalent everywhere, Geoscience Australia, Natural Resource Canada, UK Ordnance Survey, I can go on, ESA, and of course, academia. Our mission in one sentence maybe is to make geospatial information, not just data, information, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, fair. I bet we'll talk a lot about that. We do this via collective problem solving. I think that's why we're here. Collective problem solving and experimentation together, resulting in international standards, best practices, and partnerships. I would like to think that at OGC, we help connect the data and the systems so that you, everybody here, can connect the world. And I'm here specifically on this, in this event, because I don't think anybody can build and maintain the Earth archives on their own. And we have to have the right standards, the right practices, and the right partnerships for the growth and sustainability. So really happy to be here. Thank you.
Well said. Thank you. Stephen, tell us a little bit about UNGHO.
So this is what happens when you're Scottish and you try to save money and you ask your wife for a haircut. I used to work at OGC, and Barb used to be my boss. So I know both people, and I know Nadine pretty well. So I know all the people and all the people within the organizations. GEO is very similar to OGC in that we're kind of the opposite way around. So we're top heavy on public sector, and we don't have as many private sector as the OGC. So we have 115 countries, which is anywhere between 750 and 1,000 national government agencies. We don't really know, but it's huge. And in the private sector, probably we know there's 55 companies in our work program, but we then have another bunch of activities we're running with another 10 to 20 companies. And then we have what we call participating organizations, and there's about 140 of those. So that's mainly like UN bodies, international organizations, large nonprofits, and those. So really, GEO has been working for, the last 16 years, looking at mainly open data through Earth observations. So there's some parallels there with the Earth Archive, and looking to drive the countries to make data publicly and openly accessible. So before FAIR that Nadine talked about was around, there was the OGC data sharing and data management principles way before FAIR. And now there's CARE, which I just talked about on the OGC session this afternoon, which is for Indigenous communities. So picking up on some of the stuff Susanna Heck's been talking about. So I think we're all very complementary, the organizations that are here. And to Nadine's point, I think that the hard part is bringing everyone together to make sure that we're all sharing information and ideas and not duplicating stuff for the end user, because they're kind of bombarded with all of us sharing ideas and information.
I think that's perfect. And I think you said it so well that, it sounds easy to say that we can all come together and collaborate, but it actually is a hard part. And we're going to try and maybe detangle some of that today. And Stephen, if it makes you feel any better, I must be partly Scottish myself. I had my husband give me a bang trim the other day. It's a little short, so I'm trying to hide it here. We can commiserate on this side on those issues. But you all have really shared what I think the audience needs to get is that as global organizations that are in touch with companies of all sizes, doing all sorts of amazing things, you really end up having quite unique perspectives and quite broad perspectives on the world. So I think all of your organizations have really been using and working to apply location intelligence or support the application of location intelligence to all of these different kinds of global problems for many years. This is nothing new, but I would say that the pandemic has rapidly increased attention on geospatial data and science. I mean, particularly in my field of health, I think it's been wonderful for me to not have to explain why GIS matters to health. But I'm wondering, how has this increased attention really impacted your work? And so Nadine, let me turn to you first for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed. So I can tell you very quickly, to me, the pandemic highlighted that although there's tons of data out there, it was not findable. It was definitely not always accessible, for sure not interoperable, and it was only reusable sometimes with a lot of hard reinventing the wheel sort of way. So none of the FAIR, right? And ask the dashboard developers, right? You know, you mentioned health, you know, there's actually, you know, so many of them, and they will tell you how hard it was to actually connect to different data sources, describing things in different ways. So I think the pandemic showed us how much we are still lagging in terms of interoperability. The health systems, again, just as an example, from country to country, state to state, county to state, not interoperable. They were definitely not, you know, easily connecting to each other's data, and especially to outside of health, population data, supply chain data, environmental data. I mean, I could go on. So I think, yes, the pandemic showed the power of geospatial. So it's great that we don't have to explain ourselves, but it also showed that we're actually not as integrated as we think we are. And that realization, I think, just like what Stephen said, you know, it sounds simple, but actually the realization, I think, is uniting us all as a geospatial community. And I think that's why you feel the buzz around geospatial these days, because we're energized to see what we have to offer is being acknowledged, but we also please want to make sure that what we are offering is not a one-time off. I think that's what the pandemic showed, you know, to me, to us.
Yeah, I really agree. It was like, you know, pulling back the curtains and exposing, you know, our bare naked systems, that we weren't as far advanced as our discussion might have alluded to. So I think those are really great points. And I would be happy to talk about that for an hour or so, because I think it's so important. Stephen, what do you have to say about how the pandemic may have impacted the work that you and Geo are doing?
So I think listening to Nadine speak, I had a bit of a realization that although there's tons of new entrants and tons of new companies, there are a number of us, and don't take this the wrong way, Nadine, but there are a number of us who are a bit older in the community. And we've been around the block and we've been preparing for some of the stuff around interoperability. And so we know what the issues are, and we know like kind of how to challenge them. And so taking that to Geo, we have something called EO for Health, which is our working group on health. And, you know, they said to me, they said, you know, prior to COVID, we were kind of struggling to engage people on how to use Earth observations really for health purposes. And it kind of quadrupled from like maybe 80, 90, 100 members to 400 or 500 members. And everybody wanted to come in and everyone wanted to share what they were doing. And so in the end, we started creating a compendium of COVID activities, which is on our website. And so real practical stuff came out of that. For example, there's something called the EO dashboard from ESA, NASA, and JAXA. So ESA being the European Space Agency, NASA being NASA, and JAXA being the Japanese Space Agency. And so then different elements of our work program were also able to use that. So we have GeoGlam, which looks at crop monitoring. Now, if you think about COVID, for some people, it's life or death. If you can't, you know, because of COVID, you can't get to the field, you can't do the work, it has impact on food security, then that's a real, you know, nobody can deny that as a case that has to take priority. And so through our GeoGlam activities, we've been able to have that kind of level of impact where, you know, people can't get out in the field, they can't do ground truthing, but we can start to use machine learning, we can start to use the EO data we have, we can start to use some of these more advanced technologies and techniques work on that. And I think COVID really helped us fast track some of that digitalization activity.
I think that's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about the same kinds of adaptation had to occur in schools and education. And so you make a good point that it forced innovation in a different direction. Barbara, did you want to comment on this question? Did the pandemic impact WGIC's work?
Well, certainly from with all the companies that are represented in WGIC, there were impacts on supply chains that they're still dealing with. So those individual companies absolutely were impacted. And some of the small and particularly a couple of the small startups actually had no revenue at all in 2020 and are still recovering from that. So there were absolutely impacts on the industry. I think there's one other point, and I agree with everything that's been said, that it certainly brought more attention to geospatial information and the role that it plays in society, whether it was the dashboards or just watching the progression, of the disease across the country, and particularly on communities that are disparate, for example, so whether it was Native American communities or poorer neighborhoods here in the United States or elsewhere around the world. But the other thing that it raised, I think, is with this attention to geospatial information, particularly with the contact tracing, I think it starts to raise the issues of the protection of personal privacy information and kind of the trade-off with protecting public health. And so that whole debate, I think, also came up during the pandemic and hadn't been mentioned. So thanks.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's another one I wouldn't mind talking about for a while, because I have some strong opinions, as I'm sure many people do, about what technology is capable of and what policies should be in place to maybe sometimes protect us from technology. But overall, I would have to say that I tend to be an optimist, but I do have this lingering fear that people are trying so hard to get back to normal that we're going to miss and lose some of these lessons and maybe forget how important interoperability is and data sharing and all of these things. I hope that doesn't happen. And I have recently been speaking about technology inflection points, getting back to my optimistic side. I really think that we're potentially, hopefully, and maybe definitely at the beginning of one now. And like you pointed out, Stephen, there's been, necessity is the mother of invention, right? We've seen huge advances in some capabilities and efficiencies in our work, and it helps to make our resources go further, no matter if those are natural or economic or capital resources. How do your organizations view the EA initiative, thinking about these different things and the advance in technology and capabilities? And do you have advice for making EA sustainable in this current and evolving world? So Stephen, let me start with you on that.
Yeah, I mean, about two years ago, Geo, the chair of our executive committee, was actually the head of Horizon 2020. So I guess what is now $100 billion budget. And he asked us to start looking at sort of results-oriented approaches. So we really changed how we do stuff. So now we look much more at value, results, and impact. And I think that's really sharpened the organization. And I think to do that from the outset is really hard. It's really difficult to do that, but I think that's really that would be my advice: is focus on that. I mean, there's another part where I see the Earth Archive fitting really nicely, and where you can also leverage a kind of a global movement. Is we're doing work with the World Economic Forum, and they coined the term 4IR on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which they describe as the advent of cyber physical systems, which is a grandiose way of saying more capabilities for people and machines, and looking at new forms of machine intelligence, big data, IoT, AI, all of that kind of stuff. And I think from the outside looking at the Earth Archive, that seems to be something that fits really nicely. So there's a way to leverage that around sort of emerging technologies and what's happening writ large in that space too.
Yeah, I agree. And, I know, Barbara, that you have some opinions about EA and maybe think about it in a way that broadens the idea. So tell us your perspective.
Yeah, I'll build on that a little bit on Stephen's remark, because I absolutely agree. From my perspective, the initiative has to be broadened. It's got to be broadened to other topical or programmatic areas. For as important as anthropology and archaeology are, particularly in the Amazon and in selected parts around the world, if you want to attract the private sector to it, and we had some wonderful examples, over the last couple days. I mean, just from WGIC members, Hexagon, ESRI, Regal, Trimble, Voxel Maps, you got a great presentation from Peter Atala yesterday. The pieces are in place. The technology is there if we start to leverage what already exists. But to get the private sector more engaged, it's also got to be around urban growth and and areas where a lot of people live, where those assets can be kind of distributed across broader population. So I think the topical areas, because whether it's LiDAR, imaging of the Earth, which is just so critical, it can affect so many different functional areas. And to bring more financiers to the table, we've got to broaden the entire base. I think that would bring more public sector in. And then just maybe going back to not only what Stephen just said about the World Economic Forum, but I'm sorry I didn't catch his name, but one of the regional speakers this morning from the lessons learned from yesterday, or the takeaways from yesterday, he commented that governments have got to get more engaged in this effort. And so whether it's using GEO, Stephen's organization as a forcing function, whether it's leveraging the work that UNGHO is doing, this is the United Nations effort, Global Geospatial Information Management, somehow you need to bring those public sector entities to the table that are worried about managing data and bring the private sector in that can add so much value. And I guess why I think the pieces are there is, again, with Voxel Maps yesterday, they put an architecture together, which this entire Earth Archive will be leveraged on. And I just think that's got to be sold much more broadly. So in addition to archaeology and anthropology, you've got to hit those other functional areas where LiDAR is just so important. So thanks.
Thank you. And Nadine, I know you have even another complementary angle on this. Tell us what that is.
Yeah, I have to build on what Stephen and Barb just mentioned, because I think if I understand it correctly, the EA is about creating this digital twin of like the whole Earth. So super ambitious, but also timely. I think super feasible, but also not easy. And just like what Barb said, I think we definitely have a lot of the technical capabilities, the data collection, the sensing, analytics, storage, modeling, blah, blah, blah. But, which is very weird for like an MIT graduate to actually say, what I'm finding these days is, I think the same message I've shared and I've emphasized at the NSF Geoconversions workshop. I think what we've done in our community with the new technologies and innovations is dabble with the possible. We demonstrate the possible and we talk about it and we share, going from the dabbling to operational at the scale of the Earth, right? The sustainable 4 years, again, operational at scale. I think we haven't made that jump yet. Right? We haven't really proved ourselves. And this is a great opportunity to do that. And just like Barb said, I think going back to the technology part, connecting those systems at this scale does not happen by magic. Just doesn't happen on its own. And it goes back to, we all need to invest, whether it's private, public, and organizations like OGC, like WGIC, like GEO, like UNGHO. It has to be this mindset that we gotta invest to actually create these large initiatives at scale, because I'm so sorry, it does not happen by magic.
So Este, I just want to pick up on, so Nadine says it doesn't happen at scale, and I agree, but a lot of people are looking at really ramping up, at least in our community, from what used to be $300,000, $400,000 to $10 or $20 million. And then I think that goes back to what Barb was saying about raising funds. So I think my point about value and impact becomes even more important. And I think that goes to the long-term sustainability, because we will have some funding that will come in for a certain amount of period. And there seems to be this cycle of 3-year projects, which is horrible. I'd like to see much more on 10-year or 20-year programs than projects. So I just wanted to pick up on those 2 points that we said.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and obviously speaks to the sustainability aspects. And so I think it's a really good conversation. And, you guys got me thinking about, there's this term very prevalent in my world of health, of equity. But equity is really a broader term, and it does cross different functional areas, and it does require that broader look at the digital twin and the context and environment of where everybody is existing and how they're living their lives. It's been a really more of a focus. It's another one of those things that's been going on for years, but everybody cares more about equity, it seems, in the last year plus. And it doesn't matter if we're looking at racism or the rural-urban differences in data or resources that are available, or the digital divide. And I wonder, from your perspectives, what you feel like we can do to identify and close gaps using geospatial data and technology. I personally feel we can solve the whole problem. But again, that's my optimistic side. So Barbara, what do you think we can realistically do with geospatial data to improve equity?
Yeah, I think, well, in addition to what's been said before about working more collaboratively on this issue, and let me digress for a minute, because that just takes a lot of time. We kind of coined, well, we didn't coin it, but we've been using this word of hyper partnering, and it's just so important, but it's time consuming. It's easier to just kind of go off and do it yourself and only work with those people that you have to, not that you should be working with. Let me just speak from the private sector perspective a little bit. I think we could be doing a better job kind of telling our story to policymakers. And that's why it's important to stay engaged in efforts like this. And I'll apologize if I've mentioned this before, but I am looking forward to a talk at the end of the day about, there's a communication talk that's going to be on, and maybe some good insights will come out of kind of communicating our messages a little bit better at this event. But we have issued a couple reports of late, WGIC, the protection of personal privacy information, GeoAIML, where the role of public-private partnerships, and we're about to do one on digital twins. And we're not only doing these reports as pieces, thought pieces back to the private sector, but we're also communicating to them to governments, because in almost every example, we've done some global scans of legislation or regulations around the world in each one of those topics. And I just think we've got to do a better job of communicating that material and actually then drilling in on particular areas where more work is needed.
Thank you for that. I appreciate those comments. Nadine, what are your thoughts on what we can do for equity?
I think we can do more. I think, I don't know how to say this nicely, but we should be talking less and trying to do more, and trying to not boil the ocean. I think that's sometimes, what we try to do, and then it's hard. So to do it iteratively, in an agile fashion, and taking every opportunity for capacity as a capacity building opportunity. And one example that comes to mind is a disaster pilot, for example, that we're planning, now with USGS and Canada in Peru. And we're relying heavily in that case on our partnership with, AWS for the cloud stuff, right? Maxar for the data and analytics stuff, so that we can deliver something for the region. But I think what I'm trying to do here, or to articulate and communicate, like Barb said, is we want to take this project as an opportunity to maybe document a roadmap or a blueprint for what needs to be done in times of disasters, to predict floods or respond or mitigate. So at least we're not having, especially the developing world or the disadvantaged communities, don't have to reinvent the wheel. So we have, at least that's why spatial data infrastructure, right? There's something there that exists that they can build on, not just the data, but also, the steps towards maybe the SDG monitoring or the indicators. So something that's repeatable. So we communicate not just the successes, but also we capture best practices. And I know it's simplifying it, but in some sort of formulas or blueprints that can help maybe with the digital divide.
Yeah, if I were to maybe try to summarize it or put a term to it, I've been thinking about this for a while, and you talked about how a lot of this doesn't happen by magic, and now you talk about a blueprint, and I would say, let's tear down structural inequities and build structural equity. Let's put it all together as an actual promise. Stephen, I know you've got perspectives.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you say that about building structural equity, because one of the things we sort of realized is that there were a lot of underrepresented and marginalized communities that are not really in geo. And so about 18 months ago, we created the Geo-Indigenous Alliance, which has been doing a huge amount of work. And there's a report coming out next week from our Indigenous Summit, which had like 1,400 people at it. So that's the first thing. But also, we've been developing at Geo an equity, diversity and inclusion group, EDI. And again, I'm one of the few men involved in that. But next week at our symposium, we're running a free and open interactive session on what that means and how people can get engaged. And I think what I see, I'm pretty active on social media, and what I see is a coming together of communities via LinkedIn. I find to be a bit older, but certainly through Twitter, there's a different generation of people coming through. And for them, it's just normal not to have any of these, barriers. Everyone's accepted, no matter where you're from, no matter how you identify, no matter what you're working on, you're just accepted. And so for me, that's where it actually probably comes back to open data for me, because open data for me is linked to open standards, which is linked to open source, which is linked to open science. Everything is all linked together under openness. And so I think that structural equity that you talked about is something we're trying to achieve, but we've never called it that.
Well, I appreciate that you're on the road, though. I think that's incredible. I think that a key aspect in how we move forward to this progression of our global conservation and sustainability efforts is policy. And I think in many ways we've alluded to that already. Unfortunately, that policy piece is complicated. It often lags behind technological advancements. So do you think each of you, starting with Nadine, is there a role for industry to help governments formulate policies that can maybe even help us move forward at a faster pace?
I will give it a shot, but I think Barb would be the expert on this. From my perspective, there's honestly not an event these days where the topic of private-public partnerships does not come up, which is really great, right? Except, as I said earlier, let's talk less and do a little bit more. The ecosystem is more interconnected than ever, and I think it's, we need to work together, right? And what do they say? If you want to go fast, go alone, and if you want to go far, go together. So from what I see within the OGC, right, industry is definitely demonstrating the possible. That's also just a fact. At the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, I think a couple of weeks ago, the UNGHO here in the US, there was this insurance industry consortium that was showing the power, which to us, it's so simple. We go back to simple, not easy, but it's, they're just pooling Earth observation data for use, by the industry, by the government during, again, disasters. So simple, so powerful. Back to your point, Barb, messaging. Messaging that we've done this. This is how you can do this. We had a meeting this week within the OGC meeting. We had the director of the autonomous safety systems at the Department of Transportation, and he stood up there and he was asking industry, right, for their help, for their expertise, because the transportation system of the future is just so complex and so 3D right now. And it's not layers, it's not air, sea, land, whatever. It's all, that's why you have the EA, right? So I think I also see government, listening, paying attention. You have industry motivated. We just need to implement some of the changes we're talking about. We have, again, the WGIC has recommendations, the UNGHO has recommendations. Let's do without boiling the ocean again. Maybe that's what's stopping us. Do little pieces at a time, but also invest to do the big thing, because changing overnight is not going to happen. But I definitely see the conversation in the right direction.
Absolutely, thank you. And I want to get to you, Barbara, as now the identified expert here. But I did want to also pull in a few comments that maybe you can respond to, or that just everybody is aware of, that are coming in from the Q&A related to this idea of policy. Somebody did thank you, Barbara, for bringing up the aspect of privacy earlier, because it's often put to the side. And then there was another comment, it just disappeared, about policy. And then somebody was asking if I was suggesting that more governments that we involve more governments in the. I was really suggesting that we involve industry in supporting governments in the process. So Barbara, what are your thoughts about this challenge of policy?
Yeah, and actually, I'm not sure I can add much more to what Nadine has said, but maybe just drill down in on one specific policy. I am still astounded in this day and age that we governments around the world have not adopted broad open data policies for all the data that they collect, whether it's space-based data, airborne, hydrologic data, terrestrial data, oceanic data. Any data that is collected at taxpayers' expense ought to be broadly and openly available. And I know the Landsat example was mentioned yesterday. If we just use that example, while it took us 30, 40 years to get that policy changed, it was largely the private sector that influenced that policy change, and some other government agencies. They played a role. But when we, the US Geological Survey, had to go forward and argue that, we just weren't credible because, it was our policy. And even though we wanted it changed, it needed the private sector to come in and say to the United States that you will grow your economy if you adopt broad open data policies. And that happened. Now, it happened way more than we ever thought it was. The economic analysis showed $1.7 billion in the United States in 1 year for that policy change, 400 million outside the United States. That's $2.1 billion. And this was back in 2011, and we were collecting $4 million to sell the data. So the private sector could do a better job of arguing to governments to adopt broad open data policies, because that's where the jobs are grown, on the private sector side, over on the industrial side, and with the creation of value-added products and services on top of broad open government data. So that's just one drill down. And I'm sure there's examples all over the place where you could make economic arguments for this.
Yeah, and I think some examples is exactly what Stephen wants to talk about. And Stephen, there's a question that may also relate to how you in particular could answer. So I want to add that to this conversation. Bill Fleming is asking what's been done regarding developing programs with US government groups like NSF, NASA, USDA, NOAA, and maybe others. I know you have some others in mind, and maybe even if anybody knows what funding efforts or bills have been discussed with members of Congress to expand LiDAR data accumulation.
So I've posted a couple of links in the chat. One of them is a talk I gave on how to communicate to policymakers as a result of an invitation from the UNGHO and the World Bank. It's fairly basic, but actually basic is important, I think. The second link is, so I actually lead a policy team. I lead two teams at GEO. One is comms and the other is policy. And that team I lead is got some scientists, it's got some policymakers, and it's got some people who sit in the middle. And really what we're trying to do is GEO agreed in I guess, just after the global agendas in 2015 to look at the UN 2030 agenda, the SDGs, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement for Climate, and more recently, we've started working on the new urban agenda around urban resilience. And so that team is really producing outputs and ideally outcomes that will drive our members, so all of the national government agencies I talked about, to understand how to use Earth observations in their policy development and decision making. So if I go back to what I mentioned at the beginning, you know, we've been working with Amazon Web Services, with Google, with ESRI, Synergize, Microsoft AI for Earth, and we've raised, you know, more than $10 million in cash and cloud credits to help least developed countries to get access to cloud services. But the whole program has been done based on global policy drivers. So anyone who wanted to apply for licenses or credits or cash had to have something that was going to respond to global policy agendas. And so we have 60 of those projects running now, and it's all publicly available. So if people want to learn about what's happening in the countries or what's happening in, I don't know, agriculture, biodiversity, disasters, climate, energy, whichever topic, forestry, water, land, urban, there's something for pretty much everyone in those projects that are underway. To Bill's point, GEO is not just about America. GEO is about the whole world. And we get a lot of money coming in from the global north to help our work in the global south. And so NASA puts tens of millions into GEOS, which is the nominal global Earth observation system of systems that GEO has been building since the start. I mean, Barb was heavily involved in that. And, you know, the European Commission, I think probably in the last 3 years, have probably put 75 million into it. So there's billions have gone into GEO to push this concept of openness and collaboration to drive policy making through, I mean, for our case, Earth observations. So I've talked a lot, but there's certainly a lot going on my side for using geospatial data, tools, technology, and services for policy development.
Well, and I think, you know, you have covered a lot, and all of us have covered a lot. This has been a really rich discussion, and just to let everybody know, we did get permission to go over by a few minutes since we started late, so I am watching the clock. And I just want to invite everybody as a closing thought to maybe speak for about 30 seconds, a quick answer, to express if you think there are other gaps that we didn't mention yet that need to be addressed to reach our conservation or sustainability goals, or what you think we should focus on next. So, Stephen, what do you think we should do next?
I think Nadine alluded earlier to sort of the people aspect, and when I used to work at OGC 10 years ago today, I was an exec director there, and I tried to introduce this concept of human interoperability. And it's still, if you look up the term, there's very little literature on it. And I'd like to see a lot more stuff being done around interactions, collaboration, whatever that means, and pushing, I recently did a course on sustainable finance, which is not me at all, but it changed my comfort zone and it gave me a huge insight into asset managers, fund managers, investment managers, bankers, who are really shaping our world with trillions of dollars in capital flows. And they have but they have very limited idea of the power of geography and what we can do with what we already have for ESG, for climate change, for biodiversity and ecosystem collapse. So we need to, and I don't want to say that stupid thing everyone keeps saying, we need to get out and talk to other people, because I'm doing that all the time. I think we just need to push our own personal boundaries a bit more. And when you've got people who are leaders like Barb and Nadine, if they're doing that, then they bring their organizations along with them.
Thank you. Nadine, your quick answer to what should we do next?
I'm gonna sound like a broken record, and I don't care. But you ask about the gap, right? I mean, I don't understand this. We can go to Mars and fly on Mars, but you can still, hit the water pipes on my street in Washington, D.C. when you dig a building. Amazon Web Services can track your package, but governments were not able to track the vaccine distribution. I mean, I can really just go on and on. I think my broken record is we're still missing the interoperability, the ability to connect these systems, and that it's not going to be magic. And that's why, again, we're here today. That's why we're here. And, that's why I was with Stephen earlier. That's why I'm with Barbara all the time, because we need to work together. And I would underline, we need to invest in the standards, in the best practices, in the experimentations that lead to the best practices, to this blueprint or the structural equity, right? It's not going to happen operationally at scale if we're not deliberate about it. So that would be my broken record.
And that's the reason, Dr. Este, that's the reason I'm sitting in a hotel room, because someone did not care about underground utilities, struck utilities. I'm in a hotel room. Look at my background. You all know my office.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank
sorry
you,
about that.
So
Barbara,
someone saw my pain, and that's Nadine.
Let me just say one. Let me say one other thing, because both Stephen's and Nadine's comments are spot on. I think one other thing we can do, and I think this might actually help Earth Archive as well, is drill down. If governments are moving too slow in selected areas, then we could be looking at city-states or city regions around the world where people actually live. And we've got good examples where the cities in some places and states in other places are actually bypassing the federal government with the adoption of, incentives to do any number of things, whether it's clean energy or social justice. And I think if I'm thinking about this largely in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, how many places around the world are the Sustainable Development Goals just stuck at the national level because it's that level that kind of understands and has adopted them in the United Nations? And there are not very many places where they've trickled down to state level, city level, or a local level. And I think in terms of benefits that would accrue from Earth Archive, I think a lot of it is going to be also where people live. And I think that's why I feel so strongly about broadening it to include other application areas. Thanks.
Thanks to you, Barbara, and thanks to all of you. Thank you also to our listening audience. I hope that you have new, broader ideas, things to think on. There's been a lot here, and thanks, Chris, for inviting us to be here today.
Thank you so much, everybody. That was really insightful. I'm going to have to go back and watch it again now, because I know I missed a bunch of stuff and I was taking notes. So it was really awesome. Thank you so much. And Barb, I just do want to say, I know that the program this time is really heavily packed with archaeologists and anthropologists. And part of that is because we've leaned on those. I am one of those. And we've leaned on those people to help us organize this first round of. But we do understand that, and as Jason Soker said yesterday with 3GAP, this is really like a Swiss Army knife. We don't even know how these records are going to be used, but we just know they're critically important. But But I want to thank everybody so much for participating, and we have to move on to our next speaker.